Welcome to Property Talk from Louise's Lounge. My name's Louise Heatley and I'm Managing Director of Exclusive Links Real Estate. With over 17 years in the market, I know a few things and I know a few people. And through our podcast series, it's an opportunity for us to give you some insights into the Dubai real estate market, discuss some interesting topics, have some guest attendees, and it's an opportunity for you to meet our team. Today we have on our podcast Cynthia Trench, Principal at Trench & Associates DMCC. Cynthia qualified as a solicitor in 1986 in Hong Kong before she moved to Dubai in 1989, and she specialises in corporate and property law as well as private client. In 1996, she obtained her licence from Dubai Ruler's Office for the first female expatriate licensed legal consultant. And in 2004, she was awarded Best Service Provider by His Royal Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum from his establishment for young entrepreneurs. Good morning, Cynthia.
Morning,
again.
Louise.
Welcome to the Property Talk from Louise's Lounge. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely. Giving your time up and talking about some topics that I love to talk about our buyers, our clients. And you've got a lot of advice, so let's get straight into it. If you can talk us through that first checkpoint that buyers should be considering when they're buying in the secondary market.
In the secondary market in particular, you're talking about a contract that is going to be drawn up by the agents for the sellers, usually, and it's a fairly standard contract called Contract F. However, what I find quite alarming, and you must tell me why people do that, some agents, not everyone, would actually say you can't amend, there's a standard contract, you can't amend it. And of course you can, because right at the bottom of the contract it says additional terms, and you can put additional conditions and you can put a separate addendum to go with the document. So for the buyer, you have to be aware of the fact that you can make amendments. That's the first point. Absolutely.
And I think it depends on the terms of the sale that you have to really put those terms in there, and you have to have it a legal term that actually balances the contract, depending on the situation.
So the second point is it depends on whether the seller is a company and whether the buyer is a company.
Is that quite complicated if it's like a seller who is a company?
It's a little bit more complicated. If the seller is a company, it depends on who owns the company, because the DLD, Dubai Land Department, wants to see the chain of ownership until you get to the ultimate beneficial owner called the UBO. And if they don't get that, then the transaction won't go through. And we've had one seller who had ownership through trusts, and that was thrown out. So he actually had to unwind the trust and get himself as the owner. So that took at least 4 to 6 months.
Oh, wow, so there's too many layers of people. Okay.
In the appreciating market, of course, the buyer's going, yeah, that's not a problem, really.
Keep it going
as
long as
but
they
in
can.
a depreciating market, the buyer would back out.
Yeah.
So that's when the seller is a company. When the buyer is a company, again, we can forewarn the buyer, don't use a trust, use a very simple corporate situation where you have very simple documents, because the more documents, the more layers there are, all the documents need to be notarized, legalized, and translated. So when you're talking about one set of company documents, that's easily around 5 to 10,000 dirhams. So that's a lot of money to cough up for one particular corporate layer. And the most important thing about that is the time taken. So the buyer has to have all the corporate documents, the special power of attorney if he's not flying in here, all notarized, legalized where he's located. That easily takes 2 to 3 weeks, easily. Now, of course, some of the agents says you can do virtual notarization through the Dubai notary, which is much quicker, but when it's a company, you can't really do that. You have to go through this whole rigmarole.
So why are people buying in company names? Is there such a benefit for it? Because there's obviously a lot of complex paperwork, as you've said.
Many different reasons. Sometimes they want to ring fence from liabilities of their own. Sometimes they want everything to be confidential, which is quite understandable nowadays with so many high net worth individuals fearing that there might be another Panama paper leakage. They prefer to have things done properly and sometimes for tax reasons, you know. So everyone has got their different reasons.
Doing that. So let's look at the extra steps a buyer needs to consider when a power of attorney is representing a seller. Are there extra steps there for a buyer?
So as you may have heard, there have been scams. Scams in terms of a person popping up and saying, I am the power of attorney holder or the attorney in fact of a person. So the buyer, unfortunately, being unaware of what's going on in the UAE and laws, they don't check it properly. So what should you check? You should first of all, of course, check that the title is real. You can easily check that at any of the trustee's office, because now the DLD title deed has got a QR code, so that you just check that. And secondly, you should check the power of attorney that it's actually authentic. It's an authentic document, and you can check that again at the notary public or ask a lawyer to check it for them. And the identity of the various persons should be revealed, the seller and the attorney in fact. So passport copies should be obtained. And that's what we call KYC, know your client.
Yeah, and it's the due diligence you should do as part of the process before you enter into transactions.
Exactly. Okay. So once that is done and everything is properly documented, that should be also reflected in the contract itself. And of course, at the time of the closing, the attorney in fact would pop up and do the signature and all the forms that's required by the DLD. So that's not actually a very difficult thing to handle, but unfortunately some people have been scammed. I have a client now who bought into Al Barsha, and the attorney took all the money from the previous owner, pretending to be the seller, and he took the money from the buyer and he ran off. So the buyer obviously had nothing. And it was an absolute scam.
Yeah, oh, it's a shame to hear. But as you say, there is processes that you can follow to actually try and avoid all of that if you do it right. So back in June, we had Arashad on the podcast, and he was talking about when clients are buying properties with sitting tenants and all the complications. So I'm sure you've had your fair share of complications there with certain clients. So do you want to elaborate a little bit more on what buyers really need to be aware of when they are buying a tenanted property?
Yeah, so first of all, you cannot evict a tenant from a property unless you have served that tenant with a 12 months notarized legal notice at the very least. If the tenant has been in breach, for example, not paying rent on time, damaging the place, etc., having uninvited other subtenants, then you have to prove that, and then you can serve a notarized legal notice with 30 days notice. But if the tenant says, I don't think I'm going to move, you have to kick me out properly, then with the evidence of the legal notice, then you have to file a complaint at the rent dispute centre, which is again in itself a process. You have to pay fees, you have to file everything in Arabic, and actually they're very helpful there. And they can actually help you without even lawyers attending to have the eviction notice done, and the court bailiff will then go and evict the person from the premises. But you can imagine that it's a bit of palaver.
It's inconvenience, it's a headache. It can be quite stressful for people, even though it is a good process.
Exactly. So for the buyers, if you don't know the process, and for some reason the seller says, oh, don't worry, the tenant has already given me an email saying that he's going to leave, let's say we're buying now and he's going to leave by December, and come December he doesn't, he's a sitting tenant, then you have to, as the new landlord, you have to then serve the 12-month notice, which is then, of course, a nightmare for the buyer.
You're waiting for that time. You've got to go into the property knowing the rights, and that unless the legal side has been followed, people can retract and change their mind. What about the scenario where the sellers give the notice to sell the property legally, correctly, as a minimum of 12 months, that can pass to the new buyer?
Yes, but then the tenant still could be a sitting tenant. So what you can do is have the tenant, and there have been tenants who are willing to do this, to sign a notarized undertaking to leave on the specific date.
Okay. Okay, and that would hold up if they actually sign that.
Exactly.
To actually leave earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. If a tenant, so a lot of the cases where an owner comes in, there is already a tenant, and there may be post-dated checks for the rest of the tenancy term that the buyer, as the new landlord, is taking over. What happens if the tenant doesn't change them? So the current owner literally has no recovery of rent for the next term in the way of post-dated checks.
So that should be a condition in the contract of sale. If you don't have that a condition precedent, at the time of closing all the checks must be replaced, then unfortunately it's the buyer's stupidity, if you don't mind me saying.
So you could actually say to the seller, you bring the checks changed,
otherwise
in
we're
my
not
name.
closing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's a good condition to include, just to safeguard.
Very important.
Safeguard, okay. But if the buyer or the tenant doesn't pay the checks, they can still follow the laws in regards to demanding 30 days for the rent.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's another safeguard in that respect.
Correct.
So there's often a little bit of a love-hate relationship between lawyers and brokers. That's not me, of course, not Cynthia. But why would we suggest that a buyer should engage a lawyer as opposed to, or including obviously their agent to represent them? What's the benefits?
Well, the disadvantage is that, let's look at it from your point of view, is that of course when you involve a third party, whether it's a lawyer or another agent, they delay things. And most agents are like going, oh, I want my money tomorrow, or the seller wants their money by next week. So it's usually a time issue, and they don't want somebody to come in and queer the pitch and start dragging things. So we usually say to the other side, or even to our client who's we would send me an email by 5 p.m. He says, I want it tonight. You know, I'm like going, then I would say to them, look, it is important that you understand two things. First of all, good lawyer should never be free and be able to do things immediately, because if that is the case, then that person doesn't have any work to do, right? Secondly, when you rush things, you'll forget certain important issues, and I need to take proper instruction. So at least give the lawyer at least 2 days to finalize the review of the contract F, and to add and augment at least the additional conditions. We actually work with a lot of the larger real estate agents like yourselves, luxury property, all the big names, and it's nice to work with them because we actually have their terms already, and we just go tweak, 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 and we charge a client the same amount of money. And 2 hours later, we would have finished the review, and actually we could turn it around within a day. So everyone's happy because the other side knows that we've seen it, and we've pointed out sometimes very important things, like, for example, the buyer's documents will not be ready, etc.
So everyone's checks for rent.
Everyone's expectations are managed properly.
I think that's the main thing, is having the expectations managed, and then time frames don't tend to impede, as opposed to, as you say, everybody's in a rush to get everything done. So talk us through the process when a buyer is purchasing a property that's owned in the company name, so the seller is a company. We might have already kind of touched on that a little bit before with the layers. Yeah,
as I mentioned, if the seller is a company that's got many layers and there's a trust at the top, usually you'll find DLD saying, you're not showing me who is the UBO, we're not going to approve this transaction.
What can the buyer do if they find the perfect property, but it's in a company name, and as you say, there's that long period of checks? Is there anything the buyers can do in that
the buyer can go to Trench & Associates and say, Trench & Associates, please speak to the seller because they need to do something about their documents. So for example, we had a client who had a BVI company at the top, and unfortunately they didn't know the process. They signed the MOA, or the contract, it's a Russell Kamer property actually, with the buyer, and they didn't know what to do. By the time they came to me, 6 months have passed. And I said, you have to have the certificate of incumbency, and that document has to be notarized and legalized. So another 2 months later, we got the document, but of course that has lapsed, the contract has lapsed, so you have to do an addendum. So you have to have a very understanding buyer, of course. And if the buyer is not understanding and all this has gone on and the certificate of incumbency then lapse as well because it's only got a 3 months or 6 months validity,
It's back to the
then
start.
the buyer could block the further sale because the addendum or the MOA has expired.
And that becomes the seller's responsibility as part
And
of
then
the
the buyer
contract.
can block the sale.
Yeah.
And it becomes an absolute nightmare, and I have that right now. So fortunately, the seller's agent is very proactive, and she applied for a court order to unblock the transaction, which is a great relief because I act for the seller. So
Yeah.
it's a nightmare if you don't know what you're doing.
I think, as you say, it's from that onset, managing expectations, get in touch, let you have a look, sort out the paperwork, know the time frames, how long it's going to take, so you have a
Exactly.
good understanding of what's actually involved in that time frame.
Yeah.
Because I agree, when the market starts changing, which it can
Yeah.
in a 3 to 4 month period, our market
Oh.
can change, and that then conflicts with the contracts.
Also, don't forget that sometimes you have a buyer's circumstance that he's flown in here, he's rented a short-term lease, he doesn't want to sit for another 6 months waiting
Yeah.
for the property to be free, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
and
personal
spend all that rent.
circumstances. Yeah, it does get involved in that. So talk us through, some clients are purchasing properties for the investor visas. So can you talk us through a little bit about the options for owners of properties?
As you know, now there's all these different varieties of golden visas, and they've actually taken the minimum down to 2 million. So if you have actually a mortgage-free or the net amount for the value of the investment is over 2 million or over, then you can definitely apply for a golden visa. So that's lovely because first of all, you don't need a sponsor. Secondly, you can actually come in once a year now or once every few years. There's no longer the 6-month requirement for you to come in to validate the visa. Thirdly, as you know, there's now all sorts of wonderful benefits, you know, with a card, you have discounts here and there, and you can dine at certain restaurants
Have you applied for one?
Well, I moved to JLT only last year, and that was a huge effort because I have to shift everyone from mainland to JLT and spent about 4,500 dirhams per person in order to do that.
Gosh.
So having spent that, and I've got a 3-year visa, I'm going to wait until
ends
then,
have a look.
and then I'm going
Yeah.
to do that.
It does allow you, the golden visa does allow you to work in Dubai as
No, you
well.
have to then apply for a separate work permit.
Okay, so the golden visa is more you coming
Just
in
a
and out,
resident,
staying, but you still need a work permit on top of that.
Correct.
Okay, to do. So COVID brought around a lot of changes, and I'm sorry, just recovering, so it's even nicer that you're here today. Did bring around a lot of changes. You know, myself personally, I feel like we're still adopting a lot of those. But in relation to buyers, what were the benefits that were brought in, and what's still in place now?
I think the whole attitude that the UAE has adopted is the main advantage that all the buyers, anyone coming from abroad, can see. Because first of all, there's now no restrictions, there's no PCR test requirement to come in. They've eased a lot of the visa requirements for incoming tourists and investors. You can actually have a special investor short-term tourism visa as well. And secondly is that they've made things hopefully a little bit more easy. So if you have been in Dubai as long as I have,
How long have you been in Dubai?
33 years.
Actually, I did announce it since '89. Oh yeah, you're
Yeah.
a bit more than me. 96 I was. So yeah, a
So-
lot more than me.
So if you've been in Dubai as long as I have, you would remember the days when DLD was the only place that handled all of the transaction. And you have to climb several floors to see that particular person who was particularly nice because all the others were a little bit less...
Who you know, you had your favourite to go
Yeah,
to.
exactly. So now, fortunately, they have subcontracted it out to all these trustees' office, which is fantastic. And these trustees, most of them are, if not university qualified, they are very, very
very
efficient, and they understand the corporate documents, the multiple layers. They understand what's a UBO, and they work with us. And usually, if we have a transaction, we're signing, let's say, this week, but we know that the closing is not until mid-September. We would have got all the documents over to the trustee's office by now to check what's a problem, and then get everything ready for the mid-September closing. So that's the second thing that's good. Fees, as you know, if you remember several years ago, they increased it to 4%, and we were like,
that's back in 2013, actually. Can you believe how long ago that was? Yeah, from 2 to 4.
And then fortunately, they've now introduced the 0.125% if you were transferring to your own immediate family or to yourself in a corporate structure, let's say. So the fees are actually quite reasonable. It's not ridiculously high as in other countries like UK, stamp duty and so on. So we've got the advantages. So I don't really see there being a disadvantage. So really there's hardly any disadvantage. So there's a lot of very advantageous points that really draw the buyers to come to Dubai.
And I really feel the benefit of the remote power of attorneys. That's a great process.
Yeah, the virtual one.
You know, the long time ago doing that whole notarizing, sending it, solicitors, foreign Commonwealth offices, back to Dubai. And it's nice quite good process now. Yeah. So I think that encourages a lot of people to, you know, easily be able to invest in Dubai from afar.
That's true.
As well, yeah. And we did cover on wills before about protecting owners and their UAE assets on a previous episode. But is there anything else you would like to add that's quite pertinent? I know you were very involved in the DIFC laws as well in 2013. So you maybe can talk to us a little bit about that and obviously the buyer's options.
Having been here for so long, I saw that there was a huge influx of will writers in the 2000s, you know, from 2002 onwards. And there were then a huge amount of cases where the clients, unfortunately, went nowhere with these so-called wills because they were not legislated. So I started knocking on the various government departments' doors, starting from, let's say, 2010, 2012, 2014, 13, right up to that point, and unfortunately didn't really get anywhere. I started with the Abu Dhabi Chamber and Dubai Chamber. They had their own legislation to worry about at that point, to draw up. So I finally went to the DIFC and I met up with Sandy Shipton, a very well-known character who worked for the DIFC before, and he said, why don't you speak to Mark Beer? And of course Mark was a little bit reluctant at first, and then I said, do you know that I think the DIFC will earn a lot of money out of this? And they went, right.
Then they prick up, okay, let's listen.
And then they introduced the new legislation by 2015. So that was a really, really wonderful thing, because you have a common law jurisdiction monitoring the registration of wills, which is actually very rare in the world even today, and signing is virtual. So there's a lot of very, very advantageous points, very innovative indeed. So virtual registration, it's registered with the registrar of the DIFC, it's in a common law jurisdiction. Obviously it's for non-Muslims, so unfortunately Muslims can't go and sign, but it really dispenses with any doubts at all that there would be a dispute. So it's one of certainty.
So they have to go with the will and what they've wrote in there, and there's no disputes on that. And they have been effectively, unfortunately, effectively implemented. Those have been followed now.
There's been a few dozen probate cases since then. It's actually in a public registry. And they do take, unfortunately, people think that, you know, when you have a will, everything will be like that. All wills take about 3 to 6 months anywhere in the world to probate. So it does take a little bit of time. So there's always things that you can do prior to your death that you can actually manage, which we can talk about another time. But when you do have a will, it will dispense with all that uncertainty, and it will go to the person to whom you want to
so
give.
you're really looking after your family and your interests.
Yeah, or charities or
Yeah.
somebody else or siblings, whomever that you wish.
Well done for being part of that. I think a lot of people out there would be very thankful that have their DIFC registered, and great to hear you were part of that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love that advice and touched on a lot of things I think people are very interested to hear about. And while it's a very strong buyer's market, there's always things they need to take care of and look out for their interests. So thank you for coming on, and I hope you will come back again soon.
Well, hopefully with a better voice.
No, you did great. No coughing. Fine. Thank you again. Thank you for tuning in today on our episode, Property Talk from Louise's Lounge. Hope you enjoyed the chat, and we hope to see you again soon. And as always, please do let us know if you have any suggestions, questions or comments. Thank you.